The headlines emanating from Washington and Tehran in the last 72 hours are not news, they are a script. When Donald Trump warns of devastating attacks as the deadline for a Hormuz agreement nears, the media treats it as a singular event, a spike in tension, a moment of high-stakes brinkmanship. This is the illusion. The reality is that we are witnessing the final mechanical unwinding of a regional security architecture that has been functionally dead for at least a decade. If you analyze the current situation through the prism of conventional military deterrence, you will miss the fundamental shift in the global power structure. The prevailing consensus suggests that the United States is currently leveraging its naval presence to force Iran into a final capitulatory deal regarding the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a strategy, that is a trap. To understand why, you must look at the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the global economy's jugular vein. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil consumption and a significant portion of its liquefied natural gas pass through a channel that, at its narrowest point, is barely 30 kilometers wide. In the 1990s, the American doctrine for this region was clear. Overwhelming presence equals absolute control. Carrier groups, air wings, and the promise of immediate crushing retaliation were enough to hold the status quo in place. It worked because the adversaries operated within the same framework of rational cost-benefit analysis. But the game has changed. The brutal reality is that advanced naval technology is not the decisive factor in a choke point. In a maritime channel defined by such extreme geographic constriction, the advantage shifts from the entity with the highest firepower to the entity with the lowest tolerance for escalation. Iran does not need to destroy an aircraft carrier to achieve its strategic objective. It only needs to make the risk to that carrier disproportionately high compared to the political cost of the mission. This is the principle of asymmetric denial. The Pentagon understands this, even if the cable news analysts do not. The current logistics trail, the movement of heavy assets away from the immediate periphery of the strait, is not a sign of tactical repositioning. It is a calculated withdrawal from a position that has become structurally indefensible. When you pull your high-value assets out of the blast zone, you are not preparing for a fight. You are preparing for the aftermath of an explosion. We are seeing the transition from active policing to offshore balancing. But the transition itself is fraught with a systemic danger that very few are willing to name: the vacuum of authority. When the global policeman begins to pack his bags, the local predators do not sit still. They prepare. The regional actors, Tehran, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, are not waiting for the deal to be signed. They are making their own arrangements. They are building redundant, localized security architectures that do not rely on an American backbone. Why is the media failing to report this? Because admitting it would require acknowledging that the unipolar moment is not just fading, it is undergoing a violent, involuntary death. Consider the mathematics of this war. The United States is currently holding the line on a deal that is essentially a bid to buy time. Tehran, however, is not negotiating from a position of desperation. They are negotiating from a position of temporal advantage. They understand that every day this conflict drags on, the American political appetite for intervention diminishes, and the structural cost of maintaining the status quo in the Strait of Hormuz becomes less tenable for the Treasury. This is the hidden logic of the current impasse. Trump's rhetoric of devastating attacks is the final desperate attempt to preserve the appearance of control. It is an effort to maintain the illusion that the United States is still the primary actor defining the regional reality. But the reality is that Iran has successfully transformed the Strait of Hormuz from a theater of trade into a theater of attrition. The market impact of this is already becoming unavoidable. It is not about the supply of oil, it is about the cost of security for that supply. The moment shipping companies perceive that the American umbrella is no longer ironclad, the insurance premiums for transiting the strait will skyrocket. That is not a diplomatic problem. That is a systemic failure. When the cost of moving energy through the strait exceeds the profit margin of the commodities themselves, the global supply chain does not just bend, it breaks. And when that happens, the ripple effects are not felt in the boardrooms of the energy giants. They are felt in the cost of your groceries, your heating bill, and your transport. That is the second-order effect of a superpower in the process of leaving. The current administration, much like its predecessors, is attempting to project strength in a region where strength is no longer defined by the ability to project force, but by the ability to manage withdrawal. They are trying to orchestrate a graceful exit, while simultaneously demanding that their adversaries bow to an order that is actively decomposing. It is a paradox that cannot be resolved. The history of empires teaches us that there is no such thing as a managed retreat from an essential choke point. You either hold it at any cost, or you lose it entirely and watch the local order reorganize itself against you. There is no middle ground. By pretending that a deal is imminent, that there is a path to a stable, status quo preserving outcome, the leadership in Washington is blinding itself to the structural necessity of the adversary. Iran's core interest is not in the specifics of a shipping deal. It is in the removal of the American presence from its sphere of influence. This is a goal that is fundamentally incompatible with the continued American reliance on the current regional architecture. We are now approaching the expiration date of that architecture. The tragedy of the current American trajectory in the Middle East is that it is being played out in a theater where the audience, the regional powers, has already left the building. When President Trump threatens devastating attacks in the final hours leading up to the Hormuz deadline, he is not merely addressing the leadership in Tehran. He is desperately trying to signal relevance to a rapidly shifting multipolar landscape. The mathematical reality of this conflict is unforgiving. The cost of maintaining American regional dominance is now higher than the regional utility of that dominance. This is not a failure of policy, nor is it the result of a single administration's incompetence. It is the exhaustion of a strategic model that has persisted since 1945. For decades, the global order functioned on a specific, fragile contract. The United States provided the security, and the world provided the market stability. When that contract is breached, when the protector signals an impending exit, the entire structure of the contract becomes a liability. The most profound, yet underreported consequence of this realization is the immediate hedging behavior of regional allies. The moment a regional power, such as Saudi Arabia or the UAE, internalizes that the American security guarantee is time-bound and contingent on domestic American politics, they begin a strategic pivot. They do not wait for the formal dissolution of their alliances. They quietly, methodically, and rapidly begin to re-engineer their relationships with the very adversaries the United States is currently trying to contain. This is what I call the realism of the vacuum. When you strip away the diplomatic rhetoric and the cable news bravado, the regional powers are simply doing what any rational, self-interested actor would do. They are ensuring they are on the right side of the power shift. They are not choosing an ideology. They are choosing survival in a landscape where the primary arbiter of that landscape is no longer present. Consider the energy infrastructure. The markets are currently pricing in a conflict premium. But this premium does not account for the permanent structural shift occurring in the background, the regionalization of energy security. If Iran successfully asserts control over the movement of energy through Hormuz, the entire global economy loses its ability to dictate the terms of trade to the Middle East. It is a fundamental transfer of leverage from the consumer to the producer. This is the second-order effect that will define the next decade. Washington's response to this shift, the attempt to force a deal through threats and posturing, is a classic example of strategic inertia. It is a superpower attempting to command the tides to stop rising. It ignores the fact that the adversary's strategic logic is not based on responding to threats. It is based on waiting for the threat to become irrelevant. Iran knows that it does not need to win a war against the United States. It only needs to outlast the American willingness to pay the tab. When you frame the conflict this way, the devastating attacks Trump promises begin to look less like a decisive strategic move and more like a tactical distraction. They are loud, they are expensive, and they serve to reassure a domestic electorate that the commander-in-chief is in control. but they do nothing to address the structural reality. The American presence is a diminishing asset that is becoming more costly to maintain by the day. The exit strategy, hidden as it may be, is not a plan for withdrawal. It is a plan for offshore balancing. This is the pivot that the military planners are actually drafting behind the scenes. It is the realization that direct intervention in the Middle East is a strategic trap. The pivot to the Indo-Pacific, the move toward the Pacific Theater, is not just a change of address. It is a fundamental shift in the American philosophy of power. It is an acknowledgement that the United States can no longer afford to be a global hegemon with the capacity to intervene everywhere, simultaneously. If the United States is to maintain its position as a superpower, it must choose its theater. It has chosen to prioritize the Pacific, and in doing so, it has effectively accepted the erosion of its dominance in the Middle East. This brings us to the hidden trap mentioned earlier. The trap is not the war itself. The trap is the belief that you can control the transition of power. You cannot. Once you signal that you are no longer the ultimate arbiter of a region, you lose the ability to manage the consequences of your departure. The chaos that will follow the American ghost exit from the Strait of Hormuz will not be a chaotic transition that can be moderated by diplomatic summits. It will be a violent, localized reality that will dictate the price of energy and the flow of global trade for years to come. And if you are sitting there wondering why you feel the uncertainty in your daily life, why inflation feels permanent, and why the global news cycle feels like it's teetering on the edge of a breakdown, you are witnessing the logic of a failing framework. We are not in a temporary cyclical crisis. We are in a structural realignment. The mathematics of the current era are cruel but clear. The era of the American ironclad guarantee is drawing to a close. The countries that will thrive in this environment are not the ones with the largest military budget, but the ones that can adapt to a world where they are, finally, on their own. So, when we look at the Hormuz deadline and the threat of devastating strikes, we have to recognize them for what they are, the final loud act of a play that is closing. The actors are still on stage, they are still shouting their lines, and the audience is still clapping on cue. But in the wings, the set is already being dismantled. The exit is not a choice anymore. It is an inevitability. Whether it happens with a deal or a war, whether it is managed or catastrophic, the outcome remains the same. The global system is moving past the American era, and the only question that truly matters is how you, as a participant in that system, prepare for the world that remains when the dust of that departure finally settles.